this is the 7th Café des Artistes, series of public discussion events focusing on individual artists within the Artist Room's collection. And I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Ruth Burgon, who is a PhD student in history of art, but more importantly, works really closely with me on the Artist Room's project, coordinates all our summary writing, so we write online texts on individual works of art. Those are available on the Tate website and soon to be on the National Gallery of Scotland website as well. And Ruth is also the brains behind a new initiative we'll have this year, which is a film screening programme. And there'll be more news about that in due course. So we're going to have film screenings about the artists, or films by the artists in the collection. Our other speaker, I should have said about Ruth as well, that her PhD is on walking. And there will be some walking stuff in this event this evening on Nauman. Our other speaker is Catherine Spencer, who teaches contemporary art at the University of St Andrews, and was today talking about performance art, I think. Isn't that right, with students? And I'm going to leave you in their capable hands. They'll talk for about 45 minutes or so. Then we'll have a break for discussion, and we'll come back together for Q&A towards the end. So thanks very much.
Right, can you hear me? That's good. Okay. Right, so I'm going to start off from a point of honesty about Bruce Nauman and say that I've had a tricky and frustrating time with him recently because he's the subject of one chapter in my thesis, and this chapter is being absolutely stubborn and refusing to show its secrets. So on the slide here, I'm showing you Bruce Nauman's studio in New Mexico. This is a relatively recent photograph, 2009. And the kind of mess that you can see here is the state that my chapter's in. A mess on the surface, but there's something hidden in there, and there are ideas brewing. And I think Nauman's got ideas brewing in this studio as well. You can see him there in the middle. So the focus of the chapter that I'm writing is the films and videos that Nauman made at the beginning of his career in the late 1960s. And in these videos, films and videos, we see him pacing and stamping, bouncing balls, playing the violin very badly, performing repetitious, mundane, everyday activities within the walls of his studio. So you can see a few stills from these films and videos on the slide. And what are we to make of these films? They seem so innocuous, yet at the same time, they are troubling, as the frustrated artist beats the bounds of his cage. In short, I found that Bruce Nauman is a deceptively difficult artist. But what do we mean when we say an artist is difficult? Maybe we mean we don't understand his work. We don't want to know what it means, and we want to know what it means. Or maybe we mean it's difficult like a mathematical problem. We can't figure it out. We need to know the answer. Or perhaps it is difficult like a difficult child. Awkward, naughty, irritating, prone to making faces and playing stupid, repetitious games. I think this last one might be closest to the truth for Bruce Nauman. The first two, the idea that we don't understand the work or approach it as mathematically difficult, assume that there's an answer, something to be worked out, an endpoint that we can reach if only we try hard enough. But the last, the idea of a difficult child, is not to be solved, only dealt with. So I'm going to talk today about Bruce Nauman as if he is a difficult and precocious child, refusing to stand in line. So this refusal to conform in his work exists on several levels. First of all, he works across many media. You'll see drawing, photography, sculpture, neon, film, video, installation, and so on, and performance as well. I should mention that because Catherine's going to talk about that later. And Nauman also sits awkwardly just outside many of the usual artistic labels that we like to put on things. So he's not quite a minimalist, not quite a conceptualist or a performance artist, but at the same time he's all of these things. It's also never quite clear whether he's sincere in his work, whether he actually means what he's doing. Should we take him seriously, or is it all a joke? So I'm going to come back to this later on. So because Nauman's such a broad-ranging artist, I'm going to try and focus on one particular aspect of his work, the body. Except that, awkwardly, of course, once you start looking at his work, the body pervades and governs all of his work. Nauman made this self-portrait on the slide early on in his career. It's called Self-Portrait as Fountain, if you can't see the title. He performs the artwork in this piece. His body becomes a kind of sculpture. In her 2007 article, Nauman's Body of Sculpture, Anne Wagner argues that Nauman was beginning to establish himself as a professional artist, and at that time he began to interrogate, attack, and splice open his chosen medium of sculpture. Like so many artists of his generation, before he could work in multiple mediums, he had to destroy the specifics of a singular medium and do so in a way that gave a nuanced account of the old medium in its traditional sense. So in this work on the slide, his splicing apart of sculpture appears in the way in which he performs attributes of traditional sculpture. He becomes a marble statue that spurts water into a fountain. Wagner characterizes the drawing, Myself as a Marble Fountain, which is on the right here, as a tongue-in-cheek adoption of the classical sculptural form, where the artist's body substitutes the statue, but a statue undergoing a process of disintegration through spewing out his inner waters, as she puts it. So not only is he performing the statue here, but he's also collapsing it by spewing out its innards. You can imagine them coming up from within and the thing itself collapsing. So Nauman's propensity to think of himself as a fountain appears in many of his works, and it finds artistic pedigree not only in the classical marble fountain, which you can see in that drawing, but also in Duchamp's famous urinal as fountain. So for Nauman, being a fountain is to be an artist, spitting his artistic creations into the world in a projectile that, if Duchamp is the model, might also be a stream of piss. So that comes back to the idea of whether it's all a joke. The true artist is an amazing luminous fountain, Nauman asserts. The artist spews forth his shining creations into the world from the plumbed depths of his very being. So this statement, the idea of being a luminous fountain, is bound to Nauman's incessant anxiety over the role of the true artist. It's an anxiety that troubled him especially at the beginning of his career, and those films and videos that I showed you at the start in which he's stamping around the studio or bouncing balls, he's doing this because he can't work out what else to do with himself. And at this time in the late 60s, he'd been untied from the supportive network provided by his art school and his peers, and was adrift and struggling. And he'd had little money for materials as well. So he reflects back on this period in an interview saying, "I was an artist and I was in the studio. Then whatever it was I was doing in the studio must be art. And what I was in fact doing was drinking coffee and pacing the floor. It became a question then of how to structure those activities into being art, or some kind of cohesive unit that could be made available to people. At this point, art became more of an activity and less of a product." So Nauman here seems more concerned with the status of the artist and the process of making than with the outcome. So this work on the slide is about just that, the status of the artist and not of the artwork. Much later in his career, Nauman was still troubling over this problem, his place in the work as an artist, or perhaps as an art worker, the maker of artworks. And in this work, Setting a Good Corner of 1999, we see Nauman building a corner fence on his property in which is called Las Madras Ranch in New Mexico, where he now lives. And over the hour of this video, we see him in real time making this corner, boring a hole in the ground and bringing in a 9-foot railway sleeper, which he tamps into the ground laboriously. It's not just work done by hand. The slide kind of suggests that he has machines as well, which he brings in. But even so, it's evidently hard manual labor, seemingly a different kind of work from artwork. But Nauman seems to collapse these two. It doesn't make much of a distinction between artwork and hard work, manual work. When he was a student at the University of Wisconsin, he absorbed ideas from his professors about the moral potential of art, stating that there is a particularly American idea about morality that has to do with the artist as workman. Many artists used to feel all right about making a living with their art because they identified with the working class. So the act of setting a good corner foregrounds Nauman's role as a laborer and the importance of having a strong work ethic and doing a job well. So being an artist then is tied up with this idea of ethical imperative for Nauman to do with working hard and not giving up. So I'm going back to his earlier career here and his experiments in his studio in the 60s. This drive towards hard work might also involve embracing failure. To be an artist is to fail as no other dare fail, Samuel Beckett once wrote. And it was also Beckett who famously said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. So in this double exposed photograph, which is called Failing to Levitate in the Studio, Nauman seems to have adopted some of Beckett's deadpan humour. The artist is seeking equilibrium, striving to defy gravity without success. Alone in his studio, he's attempting to float, to succeed as an artist, to produce worthy work. But all these efforts are compromised. You can see him falling on the floor at the same time as floating. We can imagine him perpetually trying and failing in a repetitive loop that resembles many of Beckett's plays. Waiting for Godot is perhaps Beckett's most well-known play, and it was described by one critic as life characterized as an endless waiting, with an endless repetitive story, with actions which do not take place, and with the threat of power and violence lurking in the background. So there's a circularity in both Nauman and Beckett, both producing works in which so much ground is covered with very little actually happening, and in which the bodies of the performance, Nauman himself or Beckett's actors, are put under tests of endurance. So in Beckett's Happy Days, for example, the actress performs the whole play buried in a pile of sand, or in Catastrophe, one actor spends the play standing still on stage. Or in Not I, the actress spends the entire performance strapped to a board behind a curtain with only her mouth showing and also her ears covered, so she's in a kind of cocoon. These tests of the body's ability to endure also structure Nauman's performances, as, to pick just one example, he holds his hands above his head for the entire hour of walking in the video works Walk with Contrapposto or Pacing Upside Down, which I showed you on the first slide, or at least Walk with Contrapposto, I think. So we also see these kind of endurance tests in works such as Feet of Clay or Thigh-ing, which I'm showing you on the slide here. He's testing the body's limits. The body in these works becomes a kind of sculptural material in its own right, malleable but durable. In Feet of Clay, the artist's feet are covered in clay in a dumb visual illustration of the axiom. So he's kind of suggesting that he's got an Achilles heel, feet of clay, this fatal weakness. So he's suggesting that, like in the work Failing to Levitate, the artist is also contemplating his own propensity for failure. So Nauman frequently puts his body under pressure. And you will have seen that on your tables you've got a work called Body Pressure, which is on the pink sheets, if you haven't noticed it. And Nauman instructs the reader in this work to press his or her body against the wall and concentrate. I'm just going to read you a little bit from it, just from the first paragraph or the first verse, if you're going to look at it as a poem, says, "Press as much of the front surface of your body, palms in or out, left or right cheek, against the wall as possible. Press very hard and concentrate." And the last section says, "Concentrate on tension in the muscles, pain where bones meet, fleshly deformations that occur under pressure. Consider body hair, perspiration, odours, smells. This may become a very erotic exercise." So you can have a go at that later. So in this work, there's a kind of tension that occurs. And there are two similar works that Nauman produced, which are also instruction pieces, one called Body as Cylinder and one called Body as Sphere, which date from a similar time. And in both these works, one's instructed to assume the shapes, to assume the shape of a cylinder or the shape of a sphere, and these kind of basic geometries. Anne Wagner notes that in order to perform these actions, one must pit immobility against utter bodily concentration. In these works, the body exists in tension between the burning action of the muscles and their immobility. So there's a kind of quivering energy in these works, a tension that exists between the stillness of the body, but the absolute energy that you have to undertake to keep it in that position. So I'm going to return to this statement, "The true artist is an amazing luminous fountain," and consider whether Nauman wishes us to take it seriously in the light of both his sincere hard work, as in Setting a Good Corner, and also his deadpan humour and quirky literalism in works like Feet of Clay. The work was actually made for Nauman's first professional studio, which was an old grocery store in San Francisco. And it was designed to be placed in the window. The image I'm actually showing you here isn't his studio, but it gives you an idea of how the work was designed to be produced on a transparency so that it could be viewed from outside the window and not from inside. So it's a kind of statement that you read as you go past. It provides a kind of advert or a slogan for the passerby. And there's a quivering line of sincerity in this work. He both believes this statement and doesn't. So I want to explore this idea of ambivalence a little further in his work. Such ambivalence also exists in these works, which are called Light Traps for Henry Moore, number 1 and number 2. They're made using a torch under a long exposure. The light describes the outline of two Moore-like figures, one sitting and one standing. And if you know Henry Moore's work, you can see that Nauman's capturing the bulky weight of Moore's sculptures, and also the way in which Moore's drawings of figures are structured using lines that describe three-dimensional mass going round the figure rather than up and down, which is quite a distinct way of drawing figures. So Nauman envisaged these light traps, as capsules to preserve the legacy of his predecessor, Henry Moore, for future generations at a time when this father figure of modern sculpture, Henry Moore, was deeply unfashionable among young artists. Nauman notes that English sculptors in particular, such as Anthony Caro or William Tucker, bad-mouthed Henry Moore, as he put it, and they considered his work old-fashioned and oppressive. And Nauman felt that while it was probably true to a certain extent, they should really hang on to Henry Moore, because he really did some good work, and they might need him again sometime. So there's a kind of sense that he wants to put Moore into a capsule, put him in the attic. There's a sense in which he's needed and not needed at the same time. So Nauman's attitude towards Moore is one of strange ambivalence. He doesn't seek to preserve him out of any fervent sense of loyalty, not being particularly fond of Moore's work, but out of a sense that dismissing him might be premature, while at the same time acknowledging in making these storage capsules that Moore's moment is over for now and he can be set aside. So in a characteristically double-edged move, Nauman's tongue-in-cheek safeguarding of Moore is matched with an equal sincerity, rather like the notion of being an amazing luminous fountain. On one level, he genuinely believes his own slogan, while on the other, he derides the notion that such a thing could ever be true. So these Henry Moore works are also about the body as an absence. The wrapped lines describe a body, but a body that's not there. This is also played out in works like this. This piece is called Device to Stand In, but it's not so obvious. The idea of this piece, this wedge-shaped thing, is to invite the viewer to place her feet within it. Anne Wagner notes that the device, on the one hand, needs a human presence to seem complete, but on the other, its integrity as a work means it should remain empty, so that the viewer will conjure a phantom figure to stand within the empty slot. And if one were to stand in the device, pinned to the spot by its restrictiveness, the sculpture would be permitted to feed itself on a body's aliveness, as Anne Wagner puts it. And she compares this idea to playing Galatea in reverse. So she's referring here to the myth of Pygmalion, who carved a statue of a beautiful woman, Galatea, who then came to life. Wagner's suggesting that the device plays the opposite role and turns the living being into a statue. So this work contains a sting, a jolt of realization that if one enters into a contract with it, it becomes a kind of trap. You can't escape, and it feeds off your aliveness. It's a violent kind of wedge, then. This work on the slide is called Neon Templates of the Left Half of My Body Taken at 10-inch Intervals, and it's a kind of literalism that you find in lots of Nauman's titles. This work places Nauman's body in a kind of trap, and its name describes exactly what it is. You can see these crooked neon lines which describe the body like the lines of light in the Henry Moore photographs, and the body, again, is absent. This work was one of 4 that Nauman showed in Harold Seaman's influential exhibition, Live in Your Head When Attitudes Become Form, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. This was a 1969 exhibition, whose first venue was the Kunsthalle Bern in Switzerland. In the introduction to the catalogue for this exhibition, the works on display were described as existing in the following categories: multiformal or non-rigid, conceptual art, earthworks, geometric abstraction, and process art. So this exhibition might arguably be seen as a microcosm of what was happening to sculpture at this historical moment, since it included the work of many artists who, like Nauman, were concerned with the nature of the sculptural object in the face of its dematerialization, or its falling apart, its spewing out of its innards, if you think back to the earlier slides. So this exhibition included work by artists such as Richard Serra, Robert Smithson, Carl Andre, Eva Hess, and Richard Long. And I'm just going to bring up the work by Richard Long that was also in this exhibition, which just allows me to hark back to my previous Café des Artistes on Richard Long. And I think these works couldn't be more different from each other. Long's piece is called A Walking Tour in the Berner Oberland, and it's an outward-looking piece, invites the viewer to think beyond the gallery walls and to imagine the walk that the artist made in the wilderness. Nauman's neon work, on the other hand, is inward-looking and cage-like, and it defines the limits of the artist's body with a threatening glow. So where Long's work is about emancipation, Nauman's is characterized by entrapment. And I'm going to just pick up on this characteristic of entrapment in other works by him. It characterizes the obsessive repetition that you find in his work. So in this work, Raw Material Washing Hands, which is part of the Artist Rooms collection, we see Nauman washing his hands over and over again for almost an hour on two screens that are in parallel, and the top one's upside down. So much like several of the performance pieces to which I've referred so far, this is also an endurance test. Like Beckett, Nauman is fascinated by the intricacies of everyday existence. And he's observing human behavior with an anthropologist's curiosity, rehearsing and dissecting everyday rituals and gestures in his studio experiments. The relentless looping of this video as well can find its sculptural equivalent in Untitled Hand Circle, which is the picture on the right. So the hands don't wash each other in this work, but they're connected together in a circle formed by an obscene gesture. So you've got the finger of one hand pointing into a circle formed by the forefinger and thumb of the next. And then they're also joined at the wrists as well. So these hands become absurdly useless. They're stuck in this position. And there's also something horrific about this work, these strange part objects hanging uncannily in midair. This work contains many of the elements that I've been picking up on already, the allusion to manual labor, the absent body, the trap. So in works like this, which is called Changing Light Corridor with Rooms, this sense of entrapment that I've been trying to characterize is turned back on the viewer. This work's also in the Artist Rooms collection, and it was recently shown in Preston, where I saw it. So one's invited into the dark, narrow space of this work, which then opens out onto two rooms on either side, which are lit with yellow bulbs that turn on and off at different intervals. So the experience is somewhat disorientating. You're compressed into too small a space, and then it opens out onto a room. And in these rooms, you might possibly encounter a stranger who happens to have entered the exhibition at the same time, which can be a bit alarming. So this is actually one of many corridor works in Nauman's body of work. And each corridor varies in the exact arrangement of the spaces, in its width and lighting, in its use of video monitors, and each provides a very specific experience and directs one's behavior accordingly. Nauman noted that when he installed his first corridor, he didn't want people to make their own performances. I wanted to control the situation. So this is quite unlike artists who at the same time were making participatory works which were playful and which invited people to come in and direct the course of their own involvement. Nauman's seeking to narrow the field of possibility so that each participant has a very specific and carefully managed encounter in which his or her behavior is subtly manipulated. So these corridor works actually originated from the piece Walk with Contrapposto, which was one of the video pieces that I highlighted at the beginning. And for this work, Nauman made a narrow plywood corridor in his studio, and then he decided to make that into a work in its own right, which is on the right-hand side. And it was first exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So for the, next slide. Okay, so this is another corridor piece. This time it includes video monitors at the end of the corridor. And for the art historian Rosalind Krauss, this introduction of video into the corridor pieces placed them on the cusp between architecture and not architecture in her expanded field of sculpture. She's written an essay that's called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, where she explains this concept more fully. The modernist architectural aspect of the corridors, Krauss argues, lies in their adoption of the promenade, so the walking up and down of this corridor, which is archi-speak for the movement of bodies through the spaces of buildings. Krauss gives the example of Frank Lloyd Wright's ramp in the Guggenheim Museum, which you walk up, and it's a unified space, so a modernist unified space, which is then contrasted with the idea of not architecture in Krauss's terminology, when the cameras and the video monitors are introduced into the corridor, placing the participant under surveillance in an echo of office buildings or apartment complexes within which televisual security measures are on constant alert. This shift from not architecture to not architecture might also be seen as a shift from modernist to postmodernist architectural spaces, a move from the whole, the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum, to the fragmented space that comes to reflect upon the subject that occupies such spaces. So surveillance fragments the subject, causes her to look over her shoulder to guard herself against that ever-present feeling that she's being watched. Even the subject's image is fragmented, recorded and placed on screens that are at a remove from her. So this experience of walking through contemporary architectural and urban spaces is distilled by Nauman in these corridor pieces. So in this corridor piece, I should describe how it works a little bit. There are two video monitors at the end. One of them has an empty picture of the corridor, as if filmed from behind, and then the other one shows the viewer as they walk in. So you see yourself retreating as you walk towards the monitors, which is disconcerting because you usually expect to walk towards your image and kind of meet it face to face, as in a mirror. So there's a kind of frustrating and fragmenting experience. You're trying to capture your own image, and it counterintuitively retreats from you. The critic Peter Plagens has observed that Nauman is the lab scientist and we're the rats. We become the test subjects of Nauman's experiments as we're placed under the same tests of endurance that Nauman placed himself under. So I'm going to wrap up now. So this talk can only be a partial truth. It's subjective and it's short, and I've not had time to talk about Nauman's use of language in depth, his puns, allusions, and aphorisms that appear in neon signs and carved in granite, as here. I've also hinted at, but neglected to elaborate upon the violence inherent in his work. Two works in the Artist Rooms collection elucidate this. They're called Violins, Violence, Silence, which is a neon work, and Violent Incident, a video. I encourage you to look up both these works online. There's an excellent text written by one of our students on one of them. And I've also given you a very brief and partial look at Nauman today. Even so, have we got any closer to managing the difficult child of Nauman's work? I'm going to end on this slide. This work, "The True Artist Helps the World by Revealing Mystic Truths," was quoted by Ben Fallon at the last Keywords event on politics that some of you might have attended. Ben, I think, was recalling it in relation to an artist's questionable status in relation to the political. But it could be interpreted in any number of ways. And here it might be a prompt for discussion. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions that we'll come back to after Catherine's talk. Is Nauman sincere here? Should we take him seriously? What about in his other works? Does an artist have a duty towards the world? If so, what kind? And if the artist fails in this duty, what role does failure play in his work? And if this is the artist's role, to reveal mystic truths, what kind of mystic truths does Nauman's work reveal, if any? But if this is not the artist's role, what is? What are artists for?
Okay, thanks so much, Ruth, for that really helpful kind of overview, I think, of Nauman's career and of his practice. So following on from Ruth's presentation, I'm just going to focus in this slightly shorter section on Nauman's relationship with performance. And what I have to say really picks up on some of the ideas that Ruth has already introduced about entrapment, so the experience of entrapment and then the process of trapping as well. And I'm also going to talk about, I'll come back to some of these performance corridors and installation corridors. If you've never had the chance to walk down a Nauman corridor, do so, because it's quite a creepy experience. Okay, so I want to focus on Nauman's relationship with performance, and particularly in the mid to late 1960s, which he frequently mediated through the process of video recording. And this was a very new technology. We've got a Sony Portapack on the left there, which only really became accessible to the public in the late 1960s, and which offered a much easier to use and access alternative to film. And then in relation to Nauman's engagement with performance, I want to talk specifically about performance and control. So I'm going to be thinking about the issue of control in his work in relationship to his 1968 piece, Stamping in the Studio. So as Ruth has shown, Nauman is a tricky artist to pin down, moving as he has between a diverse range of media, from sculpture through to photography. I'm particularly interested in what might be described as his ambivalent, even antagonistic relationship with performance, which he seems to have employed in his practice almost unwillingly at times. Nauman took care to distinguish what he meant by performance, as distinguished from the activities, events, and participatory actions that had developed, particularly in North America, but also in Europe, Latin America, and Japan, since the late 1950s and early 1960s. As Ruth has already touched on, the mode of performance art developed by Nauman is very different from the informal group happenings pioneered by practitioners like Alan Kaprow in the US context, and also from the emergence of body art that we also see happening in the 1960s. So this is a slide showing Alan Kaprow's first happening, 18 happenings in 6 parts, which involved lots of performers, took place in front of a large audience in a kind of hot, sweaty gallery environment. So very, very different from the kinds of solo video recorded performances that we see Nauman doing. This is another Kaprow environment called Words from 1962, where the audience were asked to really get involved, to take these sections of words, rearrange them, and make their own poems. So there was a clear participatory gesture to works like this. And then we've also got Carolee Schneemann's Meet Joy happening from 1964, which was a kind of erotic rite, it gets described as, where she and her performers kind of rolled around in paint and bits of chicken and meat and fish. So really sensual, really quite erotic, quite extreme. Again, very, very different from what Nauman's interested in. So in contrast to this, Nauman produced performances that were primarily executed alone and were either filmed in the first instance or then videoed a bit later on, rather than being shown directly to an audience. So his performance is always kind of anticipating and going through a process of mediation. It's always being communicated. There's a sense then in which Nauman's understanding of performance is almost based in negation, in which on a very kind of literal level, he attempts to exert artistic control by making clear what his work is not and what he doesn't like. In various interviews during his career, Nauman has stressed that he mistrusts audience participation, which is why he tries to make his performance works as, quote, limiting as possible. He's comparably spoken of his concern with, quote, not allowing people to make their own performance out of my art, which I think is quite an interesting idea, and a sentence which betrays a good deal of anxiety on Nauman's part. Performance might be a way in which others can gain control and ownership over his work, and that he clearly didn't want. Early on in his career, Nauman also spoke of his discomfort in working with other performers, although he did occasionally use professional dancers when showing some works at exhibition. He reflected, quote, I always prefer to do them myself, although I've given instructions to someone else from time to time. It's a bit more difficult than doing it myself. I have to make the instructions really explicit because I trust myself as a performer much more than I do others. What I try to do is make the situation sufficiently specific so that the dancer can't interpret his position too much. So clearly, issues of control are really at the forefront of Nauman's mind as he was experimenting with performance. And I just wanted to include one of the performance scripts. So this is an example where he did give instructions to another performer, and I'll just read it out to you because there's no way I think anyone's eyesight will be good enough. So this is a script for performance (slightly crouched) from 1968, and he says, "You must hire a dancer to perform the following exercise each day of the exhibition for 20 minutes or 40 minutes at about the same time each day. The dancer dressed in the simple street or exercise clothes will enter a large room of the gallery. The guards will clear the rooms, only allowing people to observe through the doors. Dancer, eyes front, avoiding audience contact, hands clasped behind his neck, elbows forward, walks about the room in a slight crouch, as though the ceiling was 6 inches or a foot lower than his normal height, placing one foot in front of the other, touching toe, very slowly and deliberately. It is necessary to have a dancer or person of some professional anonymous presence. At the end of the time period, the dancer leaves and the guards again allow people into the room." So you can see there's a real desire to control the performance situation happening in these early scripts. As we've already heard, some of Nauman's first performances evolved in part from his experience of being cast adrift in the studio and left largely to his own devices after graduating and moving to San Francisco. Nauman turned to video as a mode of both recording and giving shape to his performances, partly out of desperation. The artist has recalled how, quote, "When I was living in San Francisco, I had several performance pieces which no museum or gallery was interested in presenting. I could have rented a hall, but I didn't want to do it that way. So I made films of the pieces, The Bouncing Ball and others. Then we moved to New York and it was harder to get film equipment, so I got the videotape equipment, which is a lot more straightforward to work with." Despite his desire to place his performances at arm's length from other modes like the happenings or street performance or even body art of the 1960s, Nauman did have links with the worlds of contemporary dance and music. While he was in San Francisco, he met and befriended the artist Meredith Monk, who as a dancer was someone Nauman looked to on occasion for professional support about his use of movement and durational performance. It was also while he was working on these video performances in the late 1960s that he met Steve Reich and Philip Glass, whose pared-down, John Cage-inspired work had a strong influence on the minimal actions that Nauman took as the focus for his video performances. Yet whereas a practitioner like Cage had favoured improvisation and chance composition, Nauman's performances, as we've already got a sense, I think, are clearly more about limiting options for going off script, both for others and for himself. And we get a really strong sense of this in the performance corridor, which you can just see here, that Ruth has already shown us, and which I just want to return to quickly before looking in depth at Stamping in the Studio. So the performance corridor consisted of 2 parallel walls placed 20 centimetres apart, which look as if they've been very hastily constructed. And the performance corridor started life as a prop for the video performance Walking with Contrapposto, in which Nauman kind of squeezes himself through the corridor and adopts this contorted bodily position. Even when displayed as a sculpture, performance corridor retains something of its prop-like quality, looking like something that has emerged from some forgotten backstage area. Even though, what I think is quite interesting about this work is that even though these corridors, as Ruth has already mentioned, are extremely claustrophobic and confining, for Nauman, the action of displaying this performance corridor in the Whitney exhibition actually involved a kind of almost destabilizing transfer of artistic authority. In an interview from 1980, he reflected, quote, "It was very hard for me to present it without any particular instructions because I felt I didn't want people to make their own performance." So that idea again. "I wanted to control the situation, and I felt that by giving something simple and uninflected as that corridor, that I was allowing people a lot more latitude than I was used to." it's this desire to manage the performance situation that really marks Nauman out from practitioners working in the happenings and in more participatory strategies, but it does align him with artists mining the tensions of video surveillance and feedback loops through the use of recording and video technology, such as Vito Acconci, Joan Jonas, and Linda Benglis. If Nauman seems hard on his audience, then he's no less demanding of himself, as his 1968 video performance, Stamping in the Studio, demonstrates. Okay, I wanted to try and show you a clip, but it's quite hard to find clips of Nauman's video performances online, and probably would have been illegal, so it's just as well that I haven't done that. But I will describe the performance to you, and hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of it that way anyway. So in this work from 1968, called Stamping in the Studio, Nauman let the duration of the videotape, which was 1 hour, define the length of the work, which he envisaged ultimately playing on a loop so that viewers could come in and out of the piece within the gallery viewing situation. There's no defined sense of beginning or end. While on the one hand, this might seem to free up the audience in that they aren't confined by precise viewing times, it also arguably stops them grasping hold of the performance and understanding it clearly. And I'm speaking from experience here, having watched the whole thing. So over the course of an hour, Nauman paces constantly around his studio, beating out a series of rhythms with his feet that explore a range of sound levels and modulate, often schizophrenically, between loud and quiet. Nauman's pounding varies in complexity and intensity. He begins with a steady 1-2 beat, where every second fall of 1 foot creates a resounding thud. And the effect is a little like hearing a melody over an ostinato bass line that keeps up a steady putter like a boat's onboard motor, except, of course, there's no melody, only the increasingly relentless footsteps. Some of the other patterns that he forms with his footsteps are more ornate, built up from a series of syncopated rhythms. The penultimate movement, if you like, of Stamping in the Studio is the one that perhaps comes closest to a dance step, where, with every other stride forward, Nauman brings his feet together, as if sketching out an extremely rudimentary, clumsy ballet. I just used the word movement to describe one of the stamping phases, and there's a sense in which the video traces a score, either musical or choreographic. It must have taken Nauman time to develop each tempo, and rather than letting them flow seamlessly into each other, he marks each shift and contrast as if to draw attention that he's designed a series of movements. At about 50 minutes into this very durational video performance, for example, he suddenly and noticeably transitions into a much slower series of steps, which gradually crescendos before dying away again in a cyclical coming and going like waves washing onto a shore. While each section of the score involves repetition, Nauman's weaving walk around his studio never settles down into a predictable pattern. You think you can start to plot exactly where he will go, but there's always a subtle shift that means his path slips through your grasp. The sound created through these modulations varies from the jarring and anxiety-inducing to a kind of soothing, almost soporific background noise, which becomes simultaneously relaxing and weirdly engrossing. Nauman controls the performance in that he executes it and prescribes the view from which a future audience will have to watch it. But he also, I think, seeks to try and manipulate an audience response, prompting them to wonder if he will exhaust himself, drop down in a faint, fall over, and raising the spectre that they might find themselves complicit in a torturous act of self-punishment, were kind of cast as unwitting witnesses, and by extension, inadvertent accomplices. While Nauman's body weaves around the space, the gaze of the camera and the gaze it prescribes, so our gaze, remains fixed in the same position. Even though we might think we're able to grasp Stamping in the Studio pretty quickly, it kind of does what it says on the tin, a little like what Ruth was saying Nauman's titles do quite a lot. There are parts of it that remain shut off to us, enforcing an awareness of the limits of vision and of our scrutiny. In a 1998 interview with the curator Chris Durkon, Nauman notes his specific pursuit of this effect. Quote, I was interested in the location of the camera in one situation. Part of the activity takes place within the range of the camera. You can see that the room is larger, and the only contact you have is the sound of the activity, and then finally the figure comes back into the range of the camera. I like that idea too. The activity goes on the camera in the sense of observing, but you can't see everything, so it misses parts. We're looking down on Nauman. The video camera seems to be positioned up on a wall or ledge, lending the scene a distinct quality of surveillance. The voyeuristic tension that imbues stamping in the studio is further underlined by the blips of static that occasionally float over the scene, which intermittently remind us that we are watching a monitored subject, although I'm not sure we can ever really forget that in this video performance. The power dynamics of this view are, however, further complicated by the fact that Nauman has placed the camera upside down, so I didn't have a mad moment when I was putting my slide together. You see him upside down in this video, creating a disorientating vantage point. Even though Nauman may have sought to distinguish his work from the wider experimentations with performance art that were happening in the US and internationally during the 1960s, stamping in the studio can be related to other performances from this decade, perhaps specifically the development of postmodern dance by a group of dancers at the Judson Dance Theatre in New York. These dancers, which included practitioners like Yvonne Rainer, sought to deconstruct the traditional rigid movement vocabularies of established dance forms like ballet, turning to quotidian gestures gleaned from the observation of people in the street and executing daily activities in order to do so. In her book on Yvonne Rainer entitled Being Watched, Carrie Lambert-Beatty argues that the work of Rainer and many other dancers at the Judson grew out of a social and political climate in which people were extremely conscious of being observed and watched, both by others and by the government within the Cold War politics of the time. Lambert-Beatty also cites the growth of and popularization of sociological studies during the 1960s, such as Irving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which was published in 1959 first, I think. I'm having a mind blank, which I really shouldn't have. And Edward T. Hall's writings on proxemics, such as The Hidden Dimension of 1966. And she argues that these kind of contemporary sociological works, which were very interested in the everyday performance of behavior, informed a widespread contemporary interest in what it might mean to present and perform the self through a repertoire of finely tuned daily gestures deployed in the workplace and at home. So contemporary sociology was experiencing a growth both in the realms of academia and in terms of its popular consumption. And it overlapped with and also fostered the emergence of performance studies as an academic discipline, and lots of early performance studies texts were based on sociological and anthropological observation. Goffman's text, for example, had a huge impact on many performance artists. Alan Caprow, Suzanne Lacey, and Martha Wilson all cite it as an influence. And in the presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Goffman set out to, quote, consider the way in which the individual in ordinary work situations presents himself and his activity to others, the ways in which he guides and controls the impression they form of him, and the kinds of things he may and may not do while sustaining his performance before them. Goffman studied a range of what he identified as everyday interactions and argued that they involved a series of elaborate performances in a range of different theatrical zones, the office, the factory, the home, and so on. Across these zones, according to Goffman, individuals engaged in a battle for dominance and control of social situations through their development of multiple different performance strategies suited to different situations. In her essay, Phenomenology, the curator Marcia Tucker identified Nauman's major interests in his artworks as follows. She wrote, the structures of sound and movement as a basic function of human behavior and communication are the phenomena which provide not only the artist, but the linguist, the anthropologist, the philosopher, and the social scientist with the sources of our knowledge of man. These are Nauman's concerns, and he sees his art as more closely related to man's nature than to the nature of art. In making the statement, Tucker was referring directly to the video works, such as Stamping in the Studio, And there's a sense in which we might almost see such works as a parallel move to that made by sociologists such as Goffman in the presentation of self in everyday life. So Nauman isn't quite so explicitly concerned with interaction, but he isolates a basic human gesture, the step or the stamp, and then pushes it through a range of permutations, as if to hammer out every possible formulation and effect. The viewpoint offered by the video camera in Stamping in the Studio has affinities with the ostensibly impassive gaze of the sociologist conducting a behavioral experiment. By presenting us with a subject who might be imprisoned or forcibly being asked to carry out a series of stamping experiments, Nauman creates an uneasy situation in which the ethics of control and observation are questioned. And there are other kind of correlations here with a work like Vito Acconci's Step Piece from 1969. And this was a work in which Acconci set himself the task of doing 30 steps on a stool within a minute for as long as possible. So he would test himself each morning as to how long he could sustain that activity over a period of months. And at the end of the month, he would send little bulletins out to his friends, updating them on his physical improvement in this task. So and we've got another example of someone setting themselves a kind of test in which their kind of physical capacity is both subject to scrutiny and also attempted to be improved. And the Critic Fraser Ward notes that lots of people have also talked about the links between the kind of social, psychological theories of people like Irving Goffman and Edward Hall and works by Acconci. And there's a sense in which perhaps some of those links have been overemphasized, but they're still very useful and important, I think, for thinking about these works and for thinking about the use of video, for thinking about the intersection of video and performance, and then the use of those two interlocking systems to think about control and observation. And I think that by setting up the potentially tense situation of Stamping in the Studio, Nauman himself might not only be kind of flirting with these kinds of behavioral and social science modes, but also questioning them and parodying them. Some commentators have drawn parallels between Nauman's movements and the rhythms that he creates in Stamping in the Studio, and generalized notions of ritual process borrowed or appropriated from Native American customs. Nauman's early experiences on the West Coast, it could be argued, might be significant in this respect. There was a strong interest in Native American customs that was fueled in part by an idealized countercultural understanding of the figure of the American Indian, which was invoked to symbolize a range of concepts from kind of anti-capitalism through to freedom of expression. For example, the avant-garde filmmaker Harry Smith, who spent time in San Francisco before moving to New York during the 1950s, made films such as Peyote Vision, which used hand-painted film spools to evoke the hallucinogenic trips inspired by the drug peyote, which was used in Native American ceremonies. Nauman's relationship with this kind of material is much more arm's length, I think. However, if he does kind of reference these ideas about ritual process with his circling and stamping in films like Stamping with the Studio, then it's a deadpan citation which implicitly mocks such invocations and identifications rather than straightforwardly celebrating them. Equally, while I think Marcia Tucker was right to observe the sociological angle of Nauman's focus on bodily movement and on the way in which people control their behaviors and kind of perform their everyday interactions, Stamping in the Studio is very far from being a transparent sociological document, suggesting instead the limits of intense scrutiny. The question is less about what we see, perhaps, than whether we want to see it. How do we respond to a video performance like this? Do we stay in the room or do we leave? Are we intrigued or bored? Do we feel obliged to stay and watch because of certain social codes and structures within the gallery experience? Because, for example, we're in an art institution or we're students or whatever, and just don't want to look like we don't get it. the relationship between performance and control, I think, lies at the heart of some of these questions. And I think both Ruth and I have really been grappling with these ideas about entrapment and control from quite a personal experience of thinking about Nauman's work. So perhaps I think now might be time to kind of hand over to you and to see what your responses are, whether you feel as kind of coerced as we do, or whether it's just, whether we've been overthinking some of these pieces and practices. Okay.
So there's now an opportunity for you to grapple with this material, to come up with your own performances, to sort of sit on the naughty step, or to be controlled, whatever you think is appropriate. And there are some materials on your tables to stimulate your thinking, and wine at the back to stimulate it even more. In small type there are the questions, I think, that Ruth posed. There's the easy ones, like, is Nauman sincere? And the more difficult ones, like, what are artists for? So we're going to leave you with these questions for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll come back together for discussion. And we may ask somebody from different tables to tell us what the discussion was. So think of a volunteer. Okay, we'll see you in a minute. Thank you for the presentations. So we thought we'd reconvene and start the discussion. And this is, you know, partly about hearing what you think, and partly giving you the opportunity as well to debate with our speakers about some of the ideas that they've shared with us. So I don't know if somebody would like to kick off by giving us some comments, observations, questions.
We've also got the works that were on your tables. So if anyone wanted to initiate discussion around any particular one of those as well, if there was a work that you found particularly intriguing, perhaps, or frustrating, or whatever.
So we're all ears.
I wondered, as I've got the roving microphone, which anyone can use in the room, but with regards to the first question, could it be that not knowing whether he's being sincere or not, you quite need to speak with Anil, is actually where the power of the work derives from? Because as soon as you put it into a box and you know what it is, maybe it's contained then and it's no longer exciting or dangerous. Like with Fluxus stuff, you didn't know when a performance started, when it ended, whether you were an audience member, a performer. And I just wondered if that question, not resolving that, was crucial to his work somehow.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. When you were just talking, then I thought you could almost argue that there's a really interesting paradoxical tension between a kind of freedom in the sense that it's so difficult to pin his work down, and then those kinds of desires for control and shaping the experience that I think we both touched on. And maybe that paradox is what really interests him, in that freedom becomes a kind of control, or control becomes a kind of freedom, without wanting to get too philosophical about it. But the humour element as well, you mentioned Fluxus and those kinds of performance which were often quite witty and wry, and Ruth mentioned she didn't have time to talk about wordplay. Neither of us have had time to talk about wordplay, but you can see from the images that were shown, particularly in Ruth's presentation, there's a huge amount of wordplay and punning going on in his work. So obviously there's something about subverting seriousness and playing with expectations that's obviously very important to his practice. Don't know if
Yeah, and I also said at the end that I didn't have time to talk about the violence in his work as well, and even the violence is humorous. So there's a work called Violent Incident that's in the Artist Rooms collection, which from the title sounds like it might be quite horrific, but actually it's a sort of slapstick violence in it. It's a man and a woman who swap places. One pulls the chair from under the other one, and it's a kind of sort of repetitive slapstick, and it's shown on lots of screens. So even the violence in his work is kind of slightly insincere as well.
Any other thoughts?
I end up doing this every time, which is why I was holding back. But we had lots of brave speakers a few minutes ago at the table. We made kind of lists of key points, and we did try to go through some of the questions, and we did stick on the point of sincerity for a good while and trying to figure out what he was getting at with these statements. One of my points was his kind of tactic of he made several works all saying this is, you know, a true artist does this and a true artist does that. So we talked a bit about how he might be sincere in making these statements, and there was a quote put up that he said, by making these statements then you see whether you believe in it when you sort of display that and you present it to other people. You judge their reaction and your own reaction. So we thought that, I think he was quite sincere, but it was definitely a method of exploration rather than any kind of finality or defining statement to it. We got a bit more confused once we got into the duty, the purpose of an artist. That's maybe too big a question for a glass of wine this size. But we thought about how he might view his role or his purpose, and that came back to a lot of the conversation about his controlling approach and trying to restrict the participation of others, and that he kind of was very clear on what he wanted to present. So while he was doing this kind of explorative approach and he would do things in private, what he presented was always very clearly his vision and his approach, and that's how he saw his role as an artist, was to be very clear that it was him and his view and his ideas, without, you know, the involvement or exploration of other people kind of impinging on what he's presenting to the public. And while we mightn't think that's the role of every artist, it seemed to be kind of his idea of how he should present to the world. We also have a long list of words that I'm not going to read out. But,
Oh, go on.
maybe John can, it's his list.
We have duty versus desire, sincerity, entrapment, repetition underlined, control, and then in parentheses, freak, frustration, controlled/restricted participation, claustrophobia, public space versus private space, and then clarifying private, enclosing, or encaging, distance over immediacy, interested in result, not just process, sincere versus serious, confrontation, as you can see it is a long list, mystic truths derived from mystic inspiration, or like supposedly artists' inspiration being mystic or unexplainable, endurance/duration, and then failure.
That's wonderful. That's like a performance script in itself, I think. What a way to end.
So, I mean, in terms of the sincerity thing, did other people have a different take on that? Or because it's the first question, I know that people might have got bogged down in it. Did anyone else have a sort of particular line on that problem or on those questions?
I just wanted to add something actually to that. You were talking about Bruce Nauman in the past tense, and I think maybe our talks had given the wrong impression that Nauman's not producing work anymore, because we both focused quite a lot on the 60s and 70s work, because already at that time, even as a young artist, he was grappling with the ideas that have existed throughout his work. So he's still producing work, and he's still interested in all these things as well. And I think Neil earlier was talking to me about the Turbine Hall exhibition that he did. What year was that?
I can't remember. I don't know if anyone saw it. Nauman was one of the artists commissioned, you know, to do a work in the Turbine Hall of Tate Modern. Can you remember when that was, Damon? It must have been 10 years ago. or maybe 6 years ago, I don't know. It's quite a while ago. Does anyone remember?
And most
No.
recently I saw the biggest exhibition I've seen by him is at the Venice Biennale in 2009, and he produced a lot of new work for that exhibition as well. And
actually, interestingly, quite a lot of sound work that, I hesitate to use the word interactive or participatory, but there was a sense you kind of moved in and out of these zones of sound, and you had to move yourself closer in order to pick up the words.
That was what the turbine hall thing was like. So most artists who've intervened in the turbine hall feel the need to do something big, right? To make some big statement. And Nauman did the most minimal thing possible. So it was this huge empty space with small speakers positioned along the edge of the floor, and you just could hear these mutterings, basically. And I just thought it showed a kind of, again, a very strong sense of confidence to change the direction of thinking about that space and what an artist might do in it. Kind of interesting in relation to both the duty and also the thing you talked about, setting a corner, this kind of workerist idea of the artist. How much labour constitutes the work of an artist? And he asked that question quite a lot, and what kind of labour, what kind of effort might be the value in the work, and so on. These are questions that come out of Duchamp, really, of that relationship to that tradition, I think. But yeah, I think he's able to do this quite striking manoeuvres, really, which is all about being quite intellectually disciplined, I suppose, about setting himself problems. Saying that, going back to the sincerity question, I guess that poses us a question about how the artist speaks to us, or how we might hear the artist's voice. What we might construe as the artist is telling us about the artist's duty to us, right? That all that's kind of bound up in a kind of situation in relation to the work, including that mystic spiral. Nobody's quite used the word irony, but that would be a Duchamp word, to see all of this as putting us in an ironic situation where we can't read it. All we've got are questions, to the work and about what's behind it, if you like. It's always asking us what's behind it. That's how it seems to me, anyway. Did anyone else have a different take on these questions?
for me, this work's very much bound up with those Henry Moore works I talked about. So it's a kind of a preservation of the idea of the artist as the revealer of mystic truths, that he's kind of clinging on to as an idea of what the artist once was, or maybe what the artist once should have been, and that he's kind of preserving that in its little capsule and keeping it in case we need it in the future, in the same way that he's doing with Henry Moore in those capsule works. But I think it's definitely open to interpretation.
You think it's keeping it in, he's preserving that space for the artist, you think?
I think he's keeping the idea. He's not necessarily preserving the space of mystic truths for artists, but he's kind of encapsulating it so that it can be kept for future generations in the same way that he's doing with Henry Moore. And there's a kind of double-edged sincerity and insincerity in that action.
What about maybe going back, I know we kind of, well, I laughed anyway, when you ended your list of words with failure, but I just wondered what people thought. I think it comes, so this is we've got, if the artist fails in this duty, what role does such failure play? But maybe we could think a bit more about failure more generally. Do people, we don't have to, but I was just curious to know if this was something that other people, or maybe going back to our group over there, or maybe other groups, was this something that you felt was playing a role in these works, or is that wrong? Are these aren't failures as works, or they aren't about failure? Or that was just a question.
Yeah, we talked about failure sometimes being more interesting than perceived success. So that, I mean, that could be failure of process or lots of different things.
Definitely. When you say failure of process, do you mean in kind of the physical things that come out, or just more
Potentially.
metaphorically, or both in a way? Mm-hmm. I think that's quite interesting, maybe going back to what Neil was just saying about the shape, the kind of zigzaggy shape Nauman's career has taken. And I think Ruth and I focused on some of the early work, which has become quite famous and quite well known. And he had a lot of early success, and he's actually talked about how debilitating, in a way, some of that early success was, because then he didn't really know where to go. So in a way, failure might help a kind of breakthrough of some of the things that, as a young artist, you get associated with almost too quickly, in a way. And if you fail, then you can break with something and get rid of it. I don't know if I'm being too negative. Someone stop me if that's so.
I guess failure is really important. Maybe it's just this British thing we have, obsessed with not failing, and always kind of the anxiety to be working and keeping busy, earning money with every action you do. And he is just wasting time. Like, he's just pacing around, like whatever money he's spending on the studio, he's like wasting it. He should be working, like, you know, he should be like producing physical objects that you can sell and commodify, but he's like, his videos aren't even real videos because he's got these angles like going down. They're like someone's secretly filming him, and he, like, he's pretending as if he's like just being watched and laughed at, I guess. So it's like ultimately, like, yeah, he's ultimately failing, but it's beautiful because he's meditating at the same time. So he's saying that maybe for me, watching those videos really seems like, or not watching stills of those videos, or like having the knowledge of his work is like, makes me feel like it's well, for me, it's like an instruction on like a meditative act. So then you're removing the kind of construct of failure and success, and it's just a thing you're spending a lot of time on. So you're devoting a lot of time to an abstract, like, motion, like stamping your feet or like pacing around. And in that space, you then learn something that's, you know, mystic, I guess. So then there's like no failure. So it's impossible to fail because everything is good. Everything produces success in a way because it's time spent doing devoting. If you devote any time to anything, then it'll eventually succeed in some form down the road. At least that's what.
That's a much more positive spin than I was putting it. Thank you. I think that goes back to what Ruth was saying about labour and the way that he's kind of rethinking what it means to be involved in artistic labour and in artwork as well. One of the works on your table is actually one that I think might speak to what you were just saying. It's called Mapping the Studio 2, so it's this kind of slightly gloomy looking one. And it's a series of films videos that he set up in his studio and just filmed what happened in the studio while he wasn't there. And so you see mice scuttling around every now and again, so he did it overnight. So it's kind of like epitomizes what you were just saying about doing absolutely nothing and removing himself from the situation. And yet what emerges from that is a very, very meditative piece, which when I saw it, I actually found quite moving. You get these little nocturnal activities of the mice, and there's a sense of the studio as a space of potential that comes through in this video work that's really interesting, and it's one of his much later pieces, so you can, from 2001, so you can see how he's moving across his career in that sense as well.
One of the artists that we worked with at the gallery, called David Rushton, he made the argument that no artwork can ever fail. And I think what he meant by that was it's a categorical thing. You put something forward to be an art object, or you don't. There's no sort of middle ground, you know. Once it's accepted to be an art object, that's what it is. That's how you frame your experience of it. I don't know if I agreed with him, but it was an interesting point, and it is that shift of something becoming an artwork. It is a framework around it that changes it, and you can't kind of go back on that or say it's failed as being an artwork somehow.
It's funny because in the history of art, there are lots of artists who failed. Of course, most of them we don't know about, right? but there are, there's a literature, or in literature there are some great failure stories. So that the best known one is Balzac's the Unknown Masterpiece, or Chef d'œuvre inconnu, which tells the story of this artist. It's set in the 17th century in Paris, and this artist Frenhofer, who is making, the greatest painting ever of this woman who he thinks is absolutely beautiful. And by the time he eventually shows it to the young Nicolas Poussin and his friend, all they can see is a mess of lines and a foot. And there's this famous thing where they say, and what a foot, kind of thing. But there's that kind of idea of a sort of utopian drive in art to realize the greatest work of art, and there are plenty of failures in artists who set themselves that task. And of course, we're in this problem with someone like Nauman, who is operating, sort of, if you like, after the great period of the avant-garde, when, that notion of failure or success, or emptiness or fullness, it's just nothing or it's everything. It's possible in a way to, within institutions, posit something as work, and to ask that kind of ironic question about it, or conceptual question about it, whatever. So it's a completely different space, isn't it, of success or failure. That said, there are lots of artists who don't succeed, still have careers, get galleries, get shows. Yeah. So I think success or failure here is a relative term. In terms of within the work of an artist like Nauman, we can think about that, but there are still museum structures, gallery structures. There are the artists in artist rooms, and then there are the others, for example. Yeah. Anyone failed as an artist? I did.
Yeah, we should be careful, really. I mean, as Ruth just said, he won that Venice Biennale, didn't he? That was the year that he won it. He's been very successful. So maybe if we went back to some of our questions about seriousness and responsibility, if you wanted to be critical, you could kind of push him on some of his. He can fail. He can be allowed to fail because he's actually been extremely successful in making institutional frameworks operate for him very, very successfully. So we shouldn't perhaps be too taken in, I think, sometimes.
Any last thoughts out there?
Just a question for Ruth. I was just wondering if you could explain a bit more about your point about Nauman's work providing some kind of space for future artists to operate in. Or kind of, you were saying, Nauman's work kind of shows the limits of what art might be, and how that could possibly be a good thing for future artists. Is that
I don't think I said that, but I think maybe
maybe I just
do you mean in
a
reference
few
to
wrong words.
the sort of capsules?
Pardon?
Do you mean in reference to the idea of Henry Moore's capsule, the Henry Moore capsule?
Just in general, I don't know, because I kind of feel like with work like this, where you're kind of pushing the boundary of what art can be. Often I feel like if I imagine myself as a future artist, I feel as though the market had kind of become saturated in terms of what art might be. I wouldn't feel inspired by Nauman's pushing the boundaries. I kind of feel as though there was nothing left to be done. Is that? I think I was having a rant here, but I think maybe does that kind of relate to something you said?
I don't know if it did specifically, but I mean, it's up to you whether you're inspired to produce anything sort of as a result of seeing his work. I actually think he's quite an artist. And when I screened his works, there were students from ECA who came along and loved his work. And I think the reason is that it does open those strange spaces of allowance, that you're allowed to walk around your studio for an hour and film it, and that's allowed to be an artistic activity. And I think he's still operating in a space that's quite like that. I recently watched a little interview with him where he was talking about going into the studio now, and as long as you're doing something, it's okay. Just keep doing stuff, you know, whatever it is, whether it's good or bad. So I think there is something for artists who are failing, perhaps, or who just want to keep trying, that he's got that kind of work ethic where you just have to keep going in and doing stuff, whether it is stamping around the studio or whether it's making weird kind of two-headed fountains, which is what he had in the Venice Biennale exhibition. And not questioning whether it's good or not at that stage, just carry on doing as a work ethic. So I think that space is useful for artists now. Just keep going.
Okay.
But I also think his time capsules are really interesting, and his choice of Henry Moore as this kind of quite unfashionable, you know, person who's being persecuted and rejected, and he's saying, oh, there might be something, you know, there's something interesting here, what we might think of as kind of retrograde and outmoded will come back. So it's a kind of interest in cycles that's maybe not linear or genealogical in the sense that we might normally think. It's about putting things on hold, and then you can use them later on. So it's about not writing off possible influences, because you never know when they might come in handy.
Yeah, and this
they're
idea
great
of
works.
mystic truths, I think, was quite unfashionable in the 60s. You know, that an artist could be a revealer of mystic truths was probably unfashionable among minimalists, maybe, who he was kind of in the same circles as at times. And so there is a sense that in this work he's just putting that really unfashionable idea out there in the same way that he puts Henry Moore out there, and doesn't mind about doing the unfashionable thing. But it's still, as you said, he still had loads of success. It didn't put people off.
Was there one more question? I think there was just...
Yeah, it's not so much about Bruce Nauman, but more about failure, because I was reading some book about from a French philosopher called François Julien, and he was spent a lot of time in China, and he would compare the Chinese cultural history to the European. And he would say actually that it's a very European thing to have a target, like make a target, like think about it, and for example, to become the most successful artist of our time. But then you start, if you make such a target, then you somehow follow your way and you confront it with the chaos of life. And there's two chances, like to fail, which is actually the bigger possibility, or to win. And he said the Chinese people, they would do it much different. They're not making actually target in the future and saying, like, I want to become the biggest artist of our time. They more would observe the situation they're into and try to create the best out of it. So always, so they come to the situation and then they're going back, like with themselves, and really just observing and trying to fetch the biggest potential of the situation and then make something beautiful out of it. And I found it kind of interesting, because then the question of failure or success somehow becomes more relative. It's not so important anymore in a way. So you have always your chance, because like you're always facing a different situation. Kind of somehow was a thought I wanted to add.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think there's a definite relativism going on in what Nauman's doing. Yeah. Ruth, did I just speak over you?
No. I was just going to say thank you for adding that. That's a good
that's a nice
addition to the discussion.
Well, I hope that you feel you've garnered some mystic truths this evening. In fact, the idea that the true artist is revealing mystic truths for us goes way back to Plato, who thought that poets were inspired by something, you know, and they had some access to mystical truths. So I suppose Nauman's attuned to that kind of, you know, quasi-mystical moment-oriented view of the artist still. So thanks ever so much, everybody, and thanks to our speakers.